All right, ready to dive into some fascinating stuff today. We're taking on havening techniques.
Yeah, this is some really interesting stuff. People are really into this whole havening thing.
And for good reason, from what I've seen, you've sent over a ton of info on this whole neuroscience-based approach to healing trauma, and honestly, it's pretty mind-blowing.
Totally agree. And what's really interesting is we're not just talking about getting over a rough week. We're talking about trauma, like the real deal.
Right, and that's where I think it's important to start. The material you sent over really emphasizes that not every negative event becomes a traumatic memory. There are actually specific criteria for something to get like hardwired into our minds that way.
Exactly. It has to meet certain conditions to become what Dr. Rudin calls traumatically encoded.
Okay, so Dr. Rudin, the innovator behind havening techniques, right?
That's one.
So he lays out some specific requirements for something to become traumatically encoded.
He does. 4, to be exact.
4 requirements, okay? Lay them on me.
Well, first off, there has to be an actual event. Seems obvious, but it's important.
Right, so not just like a bad dream or something.
Exactly. Something you directly experienced, witnessed, or even just heard about.
Okay, so that's the first requirement. An actual event. What's next?
So that event, it has to have personal meaning to you. Like it needs to trigger a genuine emotional response. Otherwise, it just doesn't have that same potential to become traumatic.
That makes sense. But the third one, this is where it gets a bit more complex for me. Dr. Rudin calls it the landscape of your brain at the time of the event. And I'll admit, that one threw me for a loop.
Yeah, it's a pretty key concept. Think of it like this. Your brain's landscape is kind of like a terrain, right? Shaped by your experiences, personality, even things like puberty, believe it or not.
You know, it's so strange how some people can go through something really heavy and seem almost unaffected by it, while someone else might go through something similar and be totally shaken. I've always wondered what makes some people more resilient than others. Is that all about this landscape idea?
Yeah, you're totally onto something. It's this whole vulnerability versus resilience thing. People who are more resilient, they tend to have that good emotional regulation, maybe a more optimistic outlook. They have good problem-solving skills.
No, interesting. So it's like having a good toolkit to navigate tough situations.
Exactly. And it's not just that. They also tend to have secure attachments and just feel more, self-contained. It's like they have this built-in buffer.
That makes sense. So are you saying that things like, I don't know, a history of early childhood trauma, or just having a hard time managing your emotions, or even having low self-esteem, those things can make you more likely to be traumatized by something that happens later on?
Yeah, unfortunately, those factors, they can create a more vulnerable landscape, so to speak. It's just harder to bounce back.
And on the flip side, does that mean that things like therapy or meditation or even just having a strong support system can actually build resilience over time?
Absolutely. It's like strengthening those internal defenses.
This is good stuff. Okay, so we've got the event itself, its personal meaning to you, and this idea of the brain's landscape. What's the 4th requirement for something to cross over into a traumatic memory?
The 4th one is the perception of inescapability. Like, if during the event you feel trapped, helpless, like there's just absolutely no escape, it's way more likely to get like deeply ingrained in your mind.
It's like that feeling of being totally stuck. And I imagine that perception of inescapability probably triggers a whole cascade of biological responses, right?
Absolutely. And that's where the amygdala comes in. It's like the brain's security checkpoint, always on the lookout for threats, and that feeling of inescapability, that sets it on high alert.
Okay, so the amygdala, it's like our brain's personal security guard, always scanning for danger. But how does it go from danger to creating these like lasting memories of trauma?
So picture this. When that amygdala senses a threat, right, it jumps into action and it starts laying down a neural pathway.
A neural pathway.
Yeah.
And that's
It's like, imagine it's building a road connecting all the emotional, physical, cognitive sensations of that moment. Everything you're seeing, hearing, feeling, even thinking, it all gets bundled up together.
okay, so the stronger that road, the more ingrained the memory becomes, the more easily it's triggered.
Exactly.
So then how does havening techniques, how does that work to disrupt this whole process? I mean, that's the big question, right?
It is. And this is where it gets really fascinating, really down to the nitty-gritty of brain science.
And I know you love the nitty-gritty.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Dr. Rudin, in this primer he put out, explains it all in a way that even I, as a neuroscience geek, can really appreciate.
Hit us with it.
It all comes down to how these pathways, particularly in the amygdala, are formed and strengthened at the cellular level. And there's this really important player in all of this called the AMPA receptor.
AMPA receptor. Okay, full disclosure, I'm more of a brain regions person than a receptors person. What are these AMPA receptors and what's their role in all of this?
Okay, so imagine your brain is like a bustling city, right? Buildings everywhere, lots going on.
Okay, I'm with you.
These AMPA receptors, they're like the doors on all those buildings. They control what information is allowed to enter and exit the neurons.
So they're kind of like gatekeepers.
Exactly. Now, when your amygdala senses danger and triggers that fight or flight response, that's like sending out an emergency alert throughout the entire city.
Gotcha.
You know what happens? That emergency alert, it throws open more of those AMPA receptor doors. So now fear signals can travel much more easily throughout your brain.
So the more AMPA receptors, the stronger the pathway, the more easily triggered that traumatic memory becomes. It's like upgrading that road we were talking about to a 6-lane highway.
Exactly. And this process of adding more and more AMPA receptors, it's called potentiation. It's what makes the memory stick around, makes it so easy to trigger.
Potentiation. Okay, got it. So where does the Havening touch come in?
This is the really cool part. So Havening touch, it aims to reverse this process through something called depotentiation. Basically, removing those extra AMPA receptors and weakening that pathway.
Wait, hold on. Removing receptors, you're saying that touch, just physical touch, can actually do that, like at a cellular level.
I know, right? Pretty wild. This is where this whole concept of electroceuticals comes in.
Electroceuticals. Okay, another new one.
It's this idea that sensory input, like touch, can actually create specific electrical waves in the brain. Things like delta waves, which you might have heard of.
I've heard of delta waves. Those are the like relaxing ones, right?
Exactly. They're like these calming vibes that can actually have real, measurable therapeutic effects.
So the Havening touch generates these delta waves, and then somehow these waves tell those AMPA receptors to pack their bags and leave.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
It's a chain reaction. So when that Havening touch is applied, especially while someone's recalling that traumatic memory, it triggers a whole cascade of events at the cellular level.
What kind of events are we talking about?
Okay, so those delta waves, those calming vibes, they actually allow calcium to enter the neuron.
Okay.
And that calcium, it activates this enzyme called calcineurin.
Calcineurin, and calcineurin does.
Think of calcineurin like a tiny little pair of scissors. It goes in and snips away the chemical anchors that are holding those AMPA receptors in place.
Oh, wow. So it's literally detaching them.
Exactly. Without those anchors, those receptors, they get pulled back inside the neuron. And that, my friend, weakens that superhighway of fear we were talking about.
That's incredible. So we're talking about actually changing the physical structure of the brain, like rewiring those pathways on a fundamental level just through touch.
You got it. It really highlights just how amazingly plastic the brain is, how adaptable it is. Even memories that feel completely fixed, like those linked to trauma, can be modified.
Okay, so this is all pretty revolutionary stuff, but I'm curious, how does Havening touch actually work in practice? What does a Havening technique session look like?
All right, so we've covered the theory, the science behind Havening techniques, all that good stuff. And it's pretty amazing stuff, right?
Seriously. But I'm also curious about the practical side. Like, what does this actually look like in practice? The source material mentioned different types of havening techniques, with event havening being like the core technique.
Event havening, yeah, that's the foundation.
Can you walk me through how that actually works, like in a session? What's going on?
Sure. So with event havening, it all starts with really zeroing in on a specific memory of that traumatic event.
Okay, so they're really going back there in their mind.
Yeah, kind of. The first step is to have the person vividly recall that event, bring back all those emotions and sensations they experienced.
Wow, so they're really back in that moment.
In a way, yeah. But here's the thing. While they're doing that, the practitioner, they're right there with them, applying these gentle rhythmic touches to their arms, their face, their hands. This is the havening touch in action.
So they're actively like rewiring the brain while the person is still experiencing that memory.
Exactly.
It's wild to think about.
It really speaks to the power of the brain, its ability to heal and adapt.
For sure.
And there's another element Dr. Rudin talks about, distraction techniques.
Okay, distraction techniques. What role do they play in all of this?
They're super important because, if you're bringing up all that traumatic stuff, it's easy to get overwhelmed. The distraction techniques, they help prevent the memory from constantly reactivating that amygdala, keeping the person from getting flooded with fear.
Right, it's like giving their brain a bit of a break while it's doing all this rewiring.
Exactly. It's about creating that safe space for the brain to process and heal.
What kind of distraction techniques are we talking about?
Oh, there's usually pretty simple things like
Uh-huh.
counting, visualizing pleasant scenes, maybe humming a familiar tune, anything that can shift their attention away from those intense emotions for a little bit.
Simple, but I bet they're really effective in breaking that cycle of anxiety that can come with trauma.
They really are. Those little distractions, they provide that much needed break, allow the havening touch to really work its magic. And the research on this stuff is really fascinating. People report these significant decreases in their distress levels, often after just one session.
Really? Just from one session of this?
That's what the data is showing. It really underscores how amazing the brain is, its capacity to heal and reorganize itself.
Yeah.
Even these super deep-seated memories, like those tied to trauma, they can be shifted.
It's pretty remarkable. Now, event havening, that's just one type, right? There are
Yeah.
others, like transpirational havening, right?
Yep.
And that one's more about addressing like chronic emotional states, things like anxiety or anger that never really seem to go away.
Yeah, exactly. The idea behind transpirational havening is that even when issues seem totally unrelated, they can actually share a common emotional root.
So instead of focusing on a specific memory, transpirational havening is more about addressing the underlying emotion itself.
Exactly. It's like instead of just pruning the branches of a problem, you're going right for the roots.
Love that analogy. And then there's outcome havening. This one really piqued my curiosity
Outcome havening, yeah, that one's pretty wild.
because it's like you're going back and actually changing the emotional outcome of a past event.
Pretty much. Again, it's not about literally changing what happened, but shifting the emotional charge that's attached to that memory. It's like you're going back and re-editing the emotional tone of a scene in your mind, changing the soundtrack.
It's like you're taking back control of the narrative even though the event happened in the past.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
And while the research is still preliminary on this one, it's super promising, really fascinating stuff.
This whole deep dive into havening techniques has been amazing. I've learned so much. It really makes you think about the mind-body connection in a whole new way, the impact that something as simple as touch can have on the brain.
It's incredible, isn't it? The brain really does have these incredible self-healing mechanisms built right in.
Totally. Well, I think there's a perfect place to wrap things up. We've covered so much ground today, from the science behind how trauma gets stuck in the brain to these really innovative techniques that can help us heal and move forward.
And who knows what other amazing discoveries are out there just waiting to be uncovered.
Exactly. That's what's so exciting about this field. There's always something new to learn. Well, thanks again for joining me on this fascinating exploration of havening techniques.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to all our listeners, thanks for tuning in. Until next time, keep those minds curious.